Paul Bonesteel is regarded as the authority on George Masa. His 90-minute DVD is a good introduction to Masa's life and work. Ken Burns included Masa in his TV series on the national parks. In the Smoky Mountains section, he focused on Masa's role in creating the park. If you ask Bonesteel or Burns about Masa's life before 1915, they'll tell you it was a mystery. They'll tell you that between 1900 and 1915, there is no evidence of anyone named Masahara Itsuka arriving in or living and working in the United States. There's no evidence of any surviving members of Masa's family in Japan. And they say there probably never will be because of the language differences and sheer numbers of people on the planet. They argue that the 1920 and 1930 censuses disagree about Masa, and they confirm that thousands of Masa's photographs are missing. These are the reasons that Bonesteel and Burns describe Masa's life as a mystery. His life before his arrival in Asheville is undocumented, and almost all his life's work has disappeared. But we know that a man's life doesn't have to be documented for his own claims about it to be accepted as true. So until it's proven otherwise, I'll rely on Masa's journals, his letters, the census, his death certificate, and what he himself has told us about his own past. Masahara Itsuka told a newspaper reporter he was born in Osaka, Japan. His death certificate states he was born January 20th, 1881. He said he moved to Tokyo to attend college. And while he was studying at Meiji University, a Methodist missionary converted him to Christianity, and that's when he changed his given name from Itsuka to George. Since family names in Asia are placed before given names, he became Masahara George. One of the mysteries of Masahara George is how to spell his name. Is it one S or two S's? Is it one I or two I's? Whether it's in English or in Japanese. But this is the correct spelling of Masa's name in Japanese. So how do you spell the Japanese character? The mystery exists only in the English language. The missionary who converted Masa to Christianity told him about the United States, and at age 25, Masa stole passage on a ship to San Francisco. Bonesteel says that there are no ship's records confirming the passage of anyone named Masahara. But would there be a record of Masa's stealing passage on a ship? Masa's name doesn't show up in the 1920 census, but the 1930 census says Masa immigrated to the United States in 2006. Masa claims he entered the University of California to major in mining engineering. His journal tells us he left San Francisco on January the 18th, 1915. He traveled by train to New Orleans and St. Louis. On July 10th, 1915, he arrived in Asheville with some Austrian students, and he went to work for the Grove Park Inn. He wrote in his journal, "The hotel is huge, and Truth is claimed to be the biggest in the world." He started working in the laundry and then as a bellhop. Then he worked as a valet for arriving guests, earning about $13 a week. It was at the Grove Park Inn that he shortened his family name from Masahara to Masa, which he said was for convenience. And he was thereafter known as George Masa. Masa hiked a lot with his Austrian friends around Asheville. He took guests on picnics in the mountains. The manager of Grove Park Inn, this you'll see is important later, loaned Masa his camera to take photographs of his guests and scenery. He figured photographs of the area would generate business for his inn. Masa made photographs for the families of Vanderbilt, Grove, and Seeley in Asheville, and got to know many of the wealthy and powerful individuals there. But in 1917, he grew tired of hotel work. So he left for Colorado Springs to prospect for gold. He exclaimed, "If God favor me, I will find some gold mine. But God did not favor him, except to show him the beauties of nature in the West. So Masa returned to Asheville asking for any job other than valet. In 1919, he quit Grove Park Inn to work in a photographic shop. In 1920, he started his own business. He wrote in his journal, "I start business myself," as named Plateau Studios. But in 1924, he sold his business to Ewart Ball, and it still exists as Ball Photographic in Asheville on Tunnel Road. In 1925, Masa set up the Asheville Photo Company. You know, one way to identify a Masa photo is by the stamp on the back. It might be Asheville Photo Company or Plateau Studios. By 1924, he was making movies as Asheville Biltmore Film Company, and he worked for Paramount and Pathé as newsreel photographer for all of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee. In April 1930, he was making movies of Dry Falls and Lower Colossager Falls between Highlands and Franklin. These movies were made 90 years ago, and we don't know where they are today. Masa has been described as a gentle soul, but the environment he worked in was very rough. He was only an inch or two over 5 feet and weighed 100 pounds. But he carried a heavy 8x10 view camera with film plates in a canvas sling and a wooden tripod on his back. He climbed up rock cliffs, through rhododendron and laurel thickets, and across trout streams and rivers. He'd hike as far as 10 or 15 or 20 miles to find the right camera location for the perfect shot. He hiked all over the Smoky Mountains 8 to 10 years before there was even an Appalachian Trail. He mapped the trail from Virginia to the Georgia border. That's why he's called the father of the Appalachian Trail as it exists in North Carolina. He also mapped hundreds of uncleared trails in the southern Appalachian Mountains. This map was his trail to Cold Mountain near Asheville. You may remember Charles Frazier's book in 1997 that was set at Cold Mountain. Masa invented a contraption, since he was an engineer, to measure distances accurately, and I put this up because it would have looked something like this. He removed the seat and back wheel of a bicycle. Then he attached an odometer to the handbars and the front wheel, so he pushed it ahead of him as he walked. With this homemade cyclometer, he walked extremely fast, which is why he wore a red bandana around his head to catch the perspiration. Tom Alexander tells us that in 1927, when Tom was leading a hike up Three Forks, one of his hikers, a hotel clerk, felt weak from exhaustion and sat down to rest. While he sat, he kept repeating, "How the hell could even a horse make it up this trail?" Suddenly, Masa came whizzing by so fast that the hotel clerk barely got a glimpse of him. The clerk hollered out, "My God, yonder goes an Indian riding a bicycle." It was during the 1920s that Masa met Horace Kephart. In 1913, Kephart had published a book called Our Southern Highlanders, which described the unique people of the Smoky Mountains. If you haven't read that book, it's still current. Kephart also wrote Camping and Woodcraft in 1906, which is a classic book about how to live in the wilderness. It's probably one of the earliest scout manuals. By the 1920s, Kephart was writing an article for National Geographic, and he needed photographs to accompany it. So he recruited Masa to help him. Both he and Masa were horrified at what logging companies were doing to the Grand Forests. Logging was no longer selective and local as it had been before 1900. It was now large-scale and commercial slashing of the land. Kephart and Masa hoped to stop the destruction if they could show the region's natural glory, or what was left of it. It was Kephart's eloquent writings and Masa's astonishing photographs that ultimately saved the Smoky Mountains from destruction. As early as 1925, Masa was promoting the Smokies as a national park. That was 9 years before it even existed. In 1933, he published a guide to the Smoky Mountains National Park, which was based on his own measurements and maps. Masa's guide was so accurate that it corrected the U.S. Geological Survey maps, which the government had given him as an aid. He'd follow the government map until what the map claimed was there wasn't there at all, or what was there wasn't what the map claimed was there. Masa would get real upset over those government maps. He'd be standing on a ridge with a survey map in hand, and he'd stamp his foot and cry out, "That damn Porter Gap, that not Gap at all." Or he'd be in the middle of a field and holler out, "Who hell called this place for cave?" Masa spent 18 years practicing his craft, and he earned the unrivaled honor of being called the greatest photographer of the Smoky Mountains. His photographs were always splendid, with deep shadows and penetrating light. Kent Priestley described this one of the Black Mountains as deep shadows and penetrating light, a bank of clouds hovering over the distant peaks, admitting enough light to touch off the horizon in a bright glow. Sunlight rolls down the valley floor arrow-like, and ending at a dark cleft that shadows the foreground completely. This is why Masa has been called the Ansel Adams of the Appalachian Mountains. Masa was taking pictures for Kephart when Frank Cook in Highlands heard about him. Cook was the manager of Highlands House, and just like the manager of Grove Park Inn, he figured photographs of the beauty of the mountains would generate business. So in 1929, he invited Masa to come to Highlands to photograph the area. Cook wasn't making a profit at the hotel at the time, but he agreed to provide Masa free room and board and cash for daily expenses, and he figured Masa would take a few days to get some good shots and then leave. But Cook didn't know Masa as the consummate professional that he was. Masa would find a view he wanted and set up his camera, but he wouldn't take a picture until the light was exactly right, even if that meant sitting for an hour, or 2 hours, or 3 hours, or a day, or a few days, or coming back for another shot. Around Highlands and Cashers, Masa photographed mountains, views of mountaintops, road scenes, attractive homes, the first golf course in the area, and waterfalls. I wish he'd photographed people. 3 days passed, 4 days, 5 days, and Frank Cook was losing income on Masa's free room and board. A week passed, and Cook was in a quandary as to how to make Masa finish up and leave. At the end of 2 weeks, Masa presented Cook with almost 100 photographs. Cook would use them to promote his hotel and the Highlands Cashers Plateau, and these photos have been preserved in the Cook Gallery of the Highlands Historical Society's museum. Masa included some of his photographs in a promotional booklet about Western North Carolina. He titled it "The Land of the Sky" and published it in 1930. And here are 3 photographs in that booklet, and I want you to look at the first one and tell me if you know where it is. Billy, you know.
Well, it's Whiteside, of course.
It is Whiteside. Where is it taken from? I don't mind you waiting a few minutes, because I waited 15 years before I figured out. I looked at that picture, and I looked at that picture, and there's something familiar about it, but I didn't know what it was. I still looked at it.
It's not the Chautauqua.
No, it's actually Green Creek. It's in Whiteside Cove, and that is Whiteside Mountain in the background, and that's the reason you don't recognize it. Because in 1929, when this was taken, there is a hole right here that you can go down into, and there's a hole about 6-7 feet. You can go down to that, be underwater, and you can slide right down here, and you get out in the water, and you walk over to a little beach, and you walk back up, and then go down. It's sliding rock. I mean, you don't think that, but all of this now is overgrown, and you don't realize Whiteside is right there. It's just not too obvious where it might be. There's this picture that he took that's in this booklet. It's not in our collection, but that's the one from Sunset Rock in 1929. And he took this one of Highlands Falls in 1929. Masa was never rich, but when the Depression hit in 1931, he lost what little bit he had. As undaunted as he was as a romantic, he wrote in a letter to a friend, "I lost every cent. I had in American National Bank. So that's that. But believe me, always my head is up, never surrender. The true test of Masa's optimism came on April 3rd, 1931, when his best friend, Kephart, died. Kep had hired a taxi to get some white lightning, and he and the taxi driver got drunk, and Kep died in the resulting car wreck. Masa was devastated. He wrote, "Kep is gone forever. His death shocked me to pieces. I never experienced such feeling in my life. But we must keep going on what we have in our hands, and I like to carry out what Kep wanted." Masa was a likable and popular man and should have died rich from the thousands of pictures that he took. But his ending was pitiable. For all the talent and fame, including his role as founder of the Appalachian Trail Club, he died of tuberculosis and other complications. He needed Mary Lapham. On June 21st, 1933, he was 52 years old. One complication might have been his prolonged respiratory exposure to harsh, darkroom chemicals. Another complication might have been the loss of his friend Kep. Masa died penniless and in debt. His friends had to pay for his funeral. This is a check from Anthony Lord for $10 for that funeral. Few people knew of Masa's financial woes. He once wrote in a letter, "Local people thinks I have plenty of money because my customers are rich people or social persons. I worked like hell, studied like hell, and got good reputation at present. And I never told anyone business is rotten. Whenever they ask, I say business fine." When Masa felt depressed about his finances and needed to renew his spirits, you might try this, he'd leave his office and, in his own words, go into the woods, get fresh balsam air, then come back and start strong, good fight. No use to worry, that's way I do. Maybe I wrong, but it good to me all time. A year after Masa's death, his dream of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park was officially recognized. Rockefeller, who had seen Masa's photographs, had given $5 million to buy the land. But it took another $1.5 million before Roosevelt could dedicate the park in 1940. It was 28 years after Masa's death when a mountain peak was named to honor him in 1961. Masa Knob, 5,700 feet, stands appropriately on the shoulder of Mount Kephart. Masa and Kephart had named most of the mountains in the Smokies. They consulted local residents and Cherokees. And one day, on a long mountain trip with Charlie Connor, a cattle farmer and mountain guide, Charlie sat down in exhaustion from the trip, rubbing his feet, and said, "I'll tell you what, this bunion feels about as big as that knoll over there." If any of you have been on the Appalachian Trail, you've been to Charlie's bunion. Masa had wanted to be buried near to Kephart in Bryson City, but his burial instead was in Asheville in Riverside Cemetery. His graveside remained unmarked there for 14 years. In 1947, the Carolina Mountain Club erected a stone bearing his name and dates. In the early 1940s, Masa's friend tried to fulfill his last wish by having his body moved from Asheville to Bryson City next to the grave of his friend Kep. But World War II was raging at the time and their project failed. If anyone here is looking for a good project, Masa still hopes to be with Kep. After Masa's death, an inventory was taken of his photographs, which amounted to 6,000 negatives. They were sold to a photographer named Elliot Fisher, who lived in Asheville until the mid-1950s. At first, Fisher sold under Masa's name, but then he sold them under his own name. Fisher moved to Florida and in 1968 committed suicide. Masa's negatives were never found. There's no trace of a single Masa image from the 6,000 that Fisher bought. It's hard to find a Masa photograph today. Recently, Western Carolina University had an exhibit of 35 of Masa's photographs. 25 were snapshot size and 10 no bigger than 3 inches, were probably used for postcards. 30 or 40 of Masa's photos were found showing the Kenilworth area of Asheville. Hunter Library in Western Carolina University has 5 Masa snapshots. Pack Library in Asheville has 7 Masa postcards retouched in color. Asheville Art Museum has 2 mountain scenes. It's only the Highlands Historical Society that has nearly 100 of Masa's photographs, which by default makes it the largest collection of Masa's photographs in the world. And the photographs in Highlands might have disappeared too if it weren't for Beverly Cook Quinn. You know her as the daughter of Frank Cook, who had hired Masa to take photographs of the Highlands Plateau, and Beverly carefully kept them, all 97 of them, preserved in their original photo album, and donated them to the Highlands Historical Society, which is the reason we have them today. The original photographs in the albums were 75 years old. Here are some of the originals next to their digital restoration, just to show you the difference. This one, you can see a few imperfections at the top of it and maybe a little piece of tape down here on the original. This isn't to say anything about the originals. The fact is, if they hadn't been taped, they still would have faded, and what we're trying to do is to make it look like it would have looked when Masa took it. So those in here have been cleaned up. You'll see the tear on that one. This one is the one that's the digital improvement. This one has a tear in it, and then that one on the right is the improvement. They're in black and white here. I put them in sepia here just because it looks better in the camera. This is the original. And then this one particularly had a tear down in the bottom, and those of you who do Photoshop know about cloning. I don't know if I got all of this over here, but we got at least the rocks so that it looks almost like it did when he took it. There are 5 road shots that he took in Highlands. This one you may recognize as you're going out the Cashers Road, where Colossagia Road turns off to the left. It used to be called Mortar Gap. That's the T-model Ford on it. This one, which is now US 64, back then was NC 28. It came up from Franklin, turned, and went out towards Cashers. That's a view of Devil's Courthouse, a little farther down from the big view. This one is the construction of the Gorge Road, and that's Bust Your Butt Falls on the right, and that's the reason it's called the quarry, is because that's where all the rock for the road was quarried, road to Highlands. And this is the cliffs between Highlands and Franklin. This is Ravenel Driveway. That's the way it did look in 1929, which was lined with white pines. And then there were 8 waterfall shots. This one is the T-model Ford. You can barely see it to the right of the falls. Beneath Bridal Veil Falls, this is looking on the upper side, and then this is looking at the lower side. And of those of you who might remember the before the bypass, in 1954, Harold Honeycutt, who was a 19-year-old boy from Seneca, Georgia, fell 75 feet down that falls because it was iced over and his car slipped off and he died. And it was 4 years later the town board approved a bypass. And I'm not sure when it was built, at the end of 1958 or beginning of 1960. We're waiting for somebody who remembers specifically to let us know when. And the question is what year it was built, but it was after 1958. This is Dry Falls. It's interesting because this used to be called Upper Colossagia Falls, and then you had Lower Colossagia Falls, and this was also called Pitcher Falls, like you're pouring water out of a pitcher. I think Dry Falls is an appropriate name. But I mean, I like the lighting in it, the light and the dark. Lighting is probably the essential element in black and white photography that's so important. This is Dry Falls. It's viewed from way down river and up on a perch that nobody would want to stand on. If you try to get where that picture is taken, you'll see how precarious it is. The light in this, I think, is what stands out most vividly. And that one is the one of the Lower Colossagia Falls. It's interesting that 2 years before Highlands was founded in 1873, Edward King came up here and did that drawing of that falls. This is Mill Creek Falls. I can't really picture this. Right there at 4th Street where Mill Creek comes in, presumably that's Mill Creek Falls. But I haven't been able to identify exactly where that is, but Masa says it's Mill Creek Falls. This is the top of Glen Falls. You are fortunate that Jonathan Haycock from Pennsylvania knew of a Glen Falls in his homeland, and he came down here and changed the name from Amicalalaga Falls to Glen Falls, which is probably a blessing for us. Amicalalaga Falls was the original name of it. There are two photographs that were taken from Black Rock. This is one of them looking at Highlands from Black Rock, and this is one of Fodderstack Mountains from Black Rock. There are three photographs he took of Horse Cove. This one is taken from Sunrise Rock, looking down into Horse Cove. This one is taken down in the cove, 1,400 feet lower. And this one was taken of Granite City in Horse Cove. There were two photographs of Raven Ball, one taken from Camp Paradise, which was on the Dillard Road, and then this one was taken from World's End on Satula. There are three photographs of Highlands Estates, which is Highlands Country Club. This is a view of Highlands Estates golf course, and as you know, they built Highlands Estate golf course to challenge Bobby Jones with a par 70 that he would never be able to make, and he came up in 1929 and on his first play made 69 and went on for the Grand Slam. This one is Highlands Estates, and that's the first club before it burned on Highlands Estate looking across the lake. This one is the number 5 tee at the fairway. He took a lot of shots of homes, which is nice to have these preserved. This is the home of Mrs. Robert Hughes. If you stand at the Civic Center and look up on Bearpin, you'll see that house on the top. This one was the home of Henry Sloan. He's the one that has the beautiful Italianate gardens that were terraced. This is the entrance to his terraced gardens. He called it Chionanda, or little hills upon little hills, and then the walls there were dry-laid with native stone. This is Sloan's ornamental pool and statuary. Those terraces are still there. Most of this is gone. The home of Mrs. Salinas was Calalanta, which was torn down, 2 years ago on the Bowery. It was Cherokee for high place or heaven. What I like about this picture is the contrast of the shadows and the light. This is the home of Colonel John Sewell on Dog Mountain. That was torn down about 10 years ago. We've lost a number of houses. They're a close-up of his house. And this is the home of Henry Bascom on Satula Mountain. This is the home of Colonel Alstetter, which is where the post office is now. It was built by Cherokee laborers for William Dobson in 1879. And we know that because you'll see under the eaves that talisman. The Historical Society got those two, the one on each side, and have them preserved. And you can't save but just so much, but that was worth saving. That's one of the evidences of Cherokees on this plateau. This is Dr. Dabney's home, and these next three pictures are interesting because that's chestnut bark on the outside. There's another one of Mrs. Michael Hoke's home at Highlands Estate, Highlands Country Club, and this one, Mrs. Clay Moore's home on Hudson Road, and that too is chestnut bark. I don't know where this is, the home of Louise Kramer. I think it's the Dillard Road, but I'm not sure. This is the home of Robert Hager. As you stand at the Nature Center and look right through there, there's a gated house, and this was his home. This is the home of Mary Lapham up on Satula Mountain, which was far away. This is the home of Marguerite and Claire Ravenel, which is known now as Wolf Ridge, was then too. And this is a beautiful view from the back of Wolf Ridge with Whiteside Mountain off in the distance. This is the home of Alice Lyons on Satula Road. That's where Satula Road and Worley Road turns off. It's there on the left. The home of Mr. Hammett on the Dillard Road. And the Anderson Sullivan House, this is interesting. It was built by Alexander Anderson in 1906 up to 1909. Took 3 years. He was the inventor of Quaker puffed wheat and Quaker puffed rice, and his income that he got from his chemical inventions that came out of Clemson University is what produced this house. Ultimately, the Sullivans took over, I think in 1926, and then in 1973, it was torn down. Sometimes pictures are the only way we preserve our history. There are 4 scenes from Sunrise and Sunset Rock, and you can't really tell from a photograph what the artist has had to endure for his perfect shot. Sometimes Masa would leave home at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he would sit in the cold and the rain, just waiting for what he called the precise atmospheric moment. That's when the sun would rise or set. And there's a tremendous sacrifice in making a photograph a work of art. I mean, now you can take your GPS and you can actually time when that sun's going to come up, but you couldn't back then. You had to just wait and hope you hit it right. Masa wasn't above altering the photograph, the scene. He would set up his camera and compose his shot, and then he would reach up and pull down an oak branch or a dogwood to frame the picture. There are 5 pictures from Bearpin Mountain. This one is Scaly and Fishhawk Mountains from Bearpin. And Masa often said that nature inspired him as a strong feeling of worship. He'd been converted to Christianity in Japan, but when someone asked him in America if he attended church, he said, "My church is out in the mountains under the trees." And you'll see a lot of Masa's church scenes like this one. These are from Satula Mountain, riding the horseback on Satula, and back then there weren't trees on top, so you had a 360-degree view. There's horsebacks on Satula, and that's Whiteside off in the background. And this is not Masa's picture, but at that time there wasn't a fire tower on Satula. It wasn't built until 1932, after Masa had left and died the next year, and it was removed in the 1950s. On Satula, looking towards Highlands Estates, and then Satula Mountain cliffs, and from here you can see wave upon wave of mountains stretching to the horizon in a stormy sea of waves. That's what they call this view, sea of views. There are 13 views of Whiteside Mountain. He loved Whiteside Mountain. Well, this is one of them, seen from Casher's Lake, and look how many times it changes in view. You wouldn't recognize it as the same mountain. Whiteside from Turkey Ridge, as you're going down into Whiteside Cove, and Devil's Courthouse from Whiteside Cove, and then Whiteside from Whiteside Cove, and then Whiteside from the Bowery. That's a beautiful picture. And then Whiteside from Bearpin Subdivision, up on Bearpin Mountain, and then Whiteside from Whiteside View. And if you walk up the Kelsey Trail at the end of it, just before you start to get onto the road, that's the view that you used to have. You're on the Kelsey Trail looking at Whiteside, which you would end up at 4 miles later. This is Whiteside from Bascom's home on Satula Mountain. This is Whiteside from Satula, and I bring up this one because this is in 1929. In 1903, Henry Skadden took this same view from Satula. There's that one by Masa, and there's that one by Skadden. And then earlier than that, in 1889, this is Whiteside from Satula. It is the same perspective, taken by Henry Osawa Tanner in 1889. He was an African American who had almost failed because of the prejudice in Atlanta, had given up on photography, had come up to Highlands to restore his soul, and it saved his life. And he ended up going off to France and became a well-known American painter. And this is one of his painters, which we found over in the Berea College of Art Department. It was on their wall. We asked them if they knew where it was, and they said no. So we told them where it is, and now they have it identified. I don't know how it got there, except that's, well, Berea College, I can understand why it would. This is Whiteside Ridge of Whiteside Mountain, and I'll mention this one. This is a photograph of the cliffs of Whiteside that was made from the side of the cliff. It's difficult and dangerous to take this one. Kephart said that Masa would photograph terra incognita. Terra meaning land, but I mean terror, O-R could be. These were scenes in the Smokies which probably no man had ever witnessed because of their inaccessibility, said Kephart. But Masa would find those scenes and risk his life photographing them. And this is one type of those scenes. Yeah.
And the views from Satula, that's the same tree that's still there, right?
Yes, it is.
Those 3.
You can actually do one now yourself and compete with Masa and Skadden and Henry Osawa Tanner.
That one little pine.
I mean, it's one of those that must be 100 years old or more.
He took all these in 2 weeks.
Yeah. Well, Frank Cook thought that was too long. But he was a very good photographer. And I suppose if he had to wait one place, he would set it aside, mark it down, and go somewhere else, and then come back to that. because he spent day after day working on it. It is amazing that he did this in such a small amount of time. This is the view on North Carolina 28, which is now 64. This is from Devil's Courthouse. That's the highway there, that streak, road's big view. If you were there, you'd look at Devil's Courthouse. This is the reverse. And he had 3 photographs of the primeval forest. And I'll mention this, that Masa has been called the Ansel Adams of the Southern Appalachians, and I think it's probably because of the photographs that he took of the Smokies, which produced a social change. And that's what made him a conservation photographer. He used photographs instead of words to help people understand and change. And I'm told the difference between a conservation photographer and a nature photographer is that the conservation photographer often shows a forest with a saw and a bulldozer in the background. Masa shows the forest, but no sign, no saw, no bulldozer, yet it produces the same result. You just want to preserve it. And I wish he could have saved our primeval forest here that went from Black Mountain all the way up to Whiteside as successfully as he saved the grand forests of the Smokies. There's a sign on that tree. You'd have to get up close to it. This is what it says on that sign. That's the rhododendron floor. And this is Henry Wright standing beside the Richardson oak, which was 8 feet in diameter, 25 feet around, and 150 feet tall. That was one of those that was lost. The forest was sold to the lumber company, which made pulp out of it after World War II. You can't blame the country clubs. It was already gone by the time they came. Camp Paradise, he did one view of that, and I'll show you this. That's 3 pictures that we pieced together that he took separately in a collage, and then I took this one below it, piecing them together so you can see what it is now and what it was then, looking from Rhodes' big view. There are 4 miscellaneous photographs. None of you will remember the fountain at 4th and Main. That was only there for 3 years. And then this was the world's smallest post office, which you still know about in Whiteside Cove. Now the interesting thing here is this is the one Masa took in 1929. That's the picture of the post office that Henry Skadden took 30 years earlier. This is a moonshine still in North Georgia. And there are 4 photographs that are not in our Cook collection. This is one of them. It's Lake Sequoia Dam. We know that it is a Masa picture because it has the number on it. It's that number in the lower left corner. That's one of his numbers, O-4728. This one is not in the collection. It's a beautiful view of Whiteside Mountain from Whiteside Cove, and there's a number there on the left corner. And then this one from Sunset Rock, and there's again a number down there in the left corner. So if it didn't have Plateau Studios on the back or Asheville Photo Company, then it might have a number. Those are ways of identifying them. This one was taken, the same scene from Sunset Rock, by Henry Skadden in 1910, and he puts the name of the scene on his. This is an overview of Sloan Gardens, which is not in our collection, but that's because Henry Sloan hired him to do these pictures, so this was in his collection. And again, it has the number in the bottom. There are 4 unmarked photographs. If it has no number or nothing, how do you identify it? And the best way we've been able to identify this one here as one of Masa's is in the one that we know is Masa's. There's that steam shovel. It was taken at the same time. That's Charlie Wright's father there, standing on the side of it. But this picture we know is by Masa. It was taken at exactly the same time, even though it has no other identification. This too, we have 2 pictures of that Model T Ford. It has a license plate on it. When you blow up this picture, it's A18940, which we found out was based in Mountain Rest. So we know that this picture, even though there's no identification, is Masa's because of the T Model Ford. And then here's another one. There's the T Model Ford again. It shows up. And there's no identification otherwise, but we know it's Masa's. This is Masa's last photo in Highlands. It's the Highlands Biological Station Board of Directors, and that was taken the year before he died. And that was in their collection and not in ours. None of Masa's do you find color, except just for the postcards that he hand-colored. Masa says that he would have loved to be able to take color photographs. Once, when he came upon a particularly beautiful scene, he wrote in a letter, "I saw wonderful colors painted by nature's brush. I just sit down, look and looked. It was wonderful." These are postcards that he hand-colored. That's one of them. This is another one of a moonshine still. You can see his original, and then you can see the one that he colored. And I like this one because he does take liberties even in his hand paintings and puts the moon in where it didn't show up in his original one. So I want to conclude this by just saying that I think one way you could describe Masa, he's a conservation warrior. Masa was more to me than just a nature photographer. This quote from Robert Russell Middlemeyer, of the president of the Conservation International, says, "Nothing does more to inspire people to protect and preserve like a vivid photo image." And Masa, his photographs, made him a conservationist. And this one, this quote by John Martin, "Photography is the most powerful conservation tool on the planet." Masa's powerful weapon was his camera. Now that you've been sitting here for a long time, I'll say to you what Masa used to say to his hikers when they were resting: "Off your seats and on your feet." And then he'd say, "More walk, less talk."